When we examine medieval manuscripts that feature the tefillah of Aleinu l'shabeach, we uncover intriguing instances of censorship within this ancient prayer. But what motivated these textual alterations? And can they be linked to a specific historical event? Delving into this subject unveils a significant episode from the year 1390, shedding light on the numerous amendments made to the text. These changes continue to influence various minhagim to the present day, and as we will see, in a curious way, connects to the day of Tes Teves, the 9th of Teves. We are looking here at a Machzor that comes from Ashkenaz, that was copied, that was written, that was transcribed in the year 1258. Today this Machzor is at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And we're looking at the page of Rosh Hashanah davening, and where in Musaf we have the tefillah of Aleinu l'shabeach. Our interest today is not the tefillah of Rosh Hashanah per se. We're interested in Aleinu because we recite Aleinu every day. But the story that we're going to tell tonight is going to surface by looking at these passages in these Machzorim. And what we immediately notice when we look at this particular passage is that the text of Aleinu, something is missing. Because after it says, there's an entire full line that appears to have words that were once there, and it's erased. And it then continues to say, there were once words here, and those words were removed. That's one anomaly that we are going to want to look at today. The second thing is that further down in Aleinu, and it says, while all of the words have nikud, the words Umoishav Yakare do not have nikud. And next to it there's a marginal note, and it says in this Machzor that instead of saying Umoishav Yakare, another option is to say Vechisei Kvoidoi. Now we know that originally it definitely was Umoishav Yakare, so there was some sort of movement to change it to Vechisei Kvoidoi, and that's the second anomaly that we're going to want to look at today and understand why and when did this happen. This is not only a story of this one Machzor, known as the Michael Machzor, and all of the links to these Machzorim are going to be presented in the show's notes. It's not only this Machzor that has these anomalies. We find this in a number of Machzorim that come from the 13th and 14th centuries in Ashkenaz that have the same idea. So here, this is known as the Esslingen Machzor. It's dated to the year 1290. Today it's at the JTS Library in New York. Here too, in Rosh Hashanah davening, you're clearly able to see how in the Aleinu l'shabeach, after the words Kechol hamoinam, the next words are taken out, and so we have a empty line with only the remnants of the older words, and if we strain our eyes hard enough, we'll actually be able to make out and read what those words used to be. A third example, this is known as the Tripartite Machzor. It's also in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. This is a little later. It's dated around the year 1320, and here what we have is two layers. First, we could tell that the words were erased, but then we could tell that a later hand put them back in on top of the erasure. And here we read the words that were erased and then put back in. Shehem mishtachimim lo hevel varik u'mispalalim el lo yoshia. That they are bowing to vanity and to nothingness, and they pray to a God who does not rescue. These are the words that were removed, and in this particular case, they were put back in. Here too, in this Machzor, instead of the words Umoishav Yakare Bashamayim Imal, originally the words Vechisei Kvoidoi were put in, and only on the side the original Umoishav Yakare is presented in the marginal note. So it's the same two anomalies that are presented in this particular Machzor. These words, Shem Mishtachim Lahevel Varik, and then number one, and number two, U'mispalim el lo Yoshia. These words are based on two psukim in Yeshaya. In Yeshaya Perek Lamed, it talks about Mitzrayim, and it says, Mitzrayim hevel varik ya'azoiru. the Egyptians help in vain and to no purpose. So Aleinu is borrowing those two words of Hevel Varik. And then in Yeshayahu Perek Memhei, there's another pasuk that speaks about the pagans, Umispalalim el lo Yoshia, that they pray to a God who does not save. And so Aleinu, this line in Aleinu, is based on these two psukim. When we look at another sample of a Machzor, this is a Machzor today at the University of Pennsylvania. It's known as a Machzor from Rhineland, late 13th, early 14th century. Here the erasure is more comprehensive. The text just reads, Aleinu l'shabech l'adain ha'koil l'seis gedula l'yetze breishis, and then from the word shalo yasanu kegoya haratzos, all of this was removed. Interestingly, in this particular Machzor, this erasure occurs in the Rosh Hashanah davening, where Aleinu is in the Rosh Hashanah davening. But then if you flip and go down to the Yom Kippur davening, here you actually see that it remains without any change. So why would it be removed in the earlier pages of the Machzor, but retained in the later pages of the Machzor? My best bet is that it is sloppiness more than anything else. And so now we have to ask the question. And the question is, why were these lines removed? Now intuitively, we think we know the answer to that. Well, they're kind of offensive, aren't they? It's like they're not saying nice things about the Gentiles, and Jews are always looking over their shoulder, and so it makes a lot of sense that either Jews removed it on their own, or that they were told by their non-Jewish hosts to remove them. And that's very reasonable. But the question we need to ask ourselves is, hold on. They were written, in all these Machzorim, the common denominator is that they were originally written there. So in other words, in the 1200s and in the early 1300s, there wasn't a problem, which is why all these scribes across the board had no problem putting the text in, and then all of a sudden they get removed. If we're worried about the offensive nature of the text, that was just as offensive in the year 1290 or the year 1310 as it would be later. So there must be some other missing information here that we need to bring into the narrative that will explain why it was okay earlier on, became problematic later on. And that's what we're in search for today. Also, let's not forget the second issue of why the words U'Moshav Yekarai were replaced with the words V'chisei Chvoidei. So let's hold on to that. There was a Rav who lived in the 1400s in Prague, and his name was Reb Yomtiv Lipman of Milhausen. And he is known as the author of a sefer that was printed in 1644 in Altdorf, and this sefer is called Sefer Nitzochai. Obviously, it was composed sometime in the late 1400s or something like that. In the early 1400s. The assumption is he passed away around 1440, so give or take that the sefer was written in the first half of the 15th century. What is the nature of the sefer? It's a commentary that goes through the entire Tanakh, but he has a very, very specific and narrow agenda. He's interested in psukim, where Christians interpret it in a Christological way, and he wants to respond to those interpretations. And that's the only area that he's interested in. So this fits into the genre of polemical works against Christianity. There's a number of these that Jews produced during the Middle Ages. This is unique in the fact that it runs al Seder HaTanakh. But then at the end, he has an essay, and a manuscript of this work of Sefer Netzachon exists today in the Bavarian State Library. And I'm reading now from this manuscript, and it has a date of when it was copied. So it was copied in the year 1460, so it brings us really close to the time of the author. And at the end of this book, after he finishes Divrei Hayamim, he then writes the following. Al ha'ma'ura hara asher lanu ira. We had a terrible incident that occurred to us. Ba'arba yamin l'chodesh elul, dalet elul, shnas chameshes alafim, mea v'chamishim le'elef hashishi. So in Elef Hashishi, it is 150 years. If you're keeping score at home, that is the year 1390, and the math equals August 6th. So in the summer of 1390, a terrible incident happened, and he describes this as Shenispasnu Leminus. Exact way of interpreting these two words, I don't know, but there was some sort of a Christian allegation against Jews that occurs at this time somewhere in Central Europe, in the year 1390 in the summer. Umitoich kach, and during this event, ba aleinu ha'epikoris, and an epikoris, that means a Jew who converted, Pesach HaMeshumad. His name was Pesach, and he's a Meshumad. He converted to Christianity, and now Hanikra Peter. He took the name Peter. And during this event, V'darash aleinu shkarim, he libeled us. And ulahafiz das ha'umais, and in order to soothe the Gentiles, hutzrachti lahashiv lai, I needed to respond. So in other words, accusations were made by this Pesach, who became Peter. Accusations were leveled against the Jewish community, and I, as the rabbi, had to defend the Jewish community. And he writes as follows: V'omar, this Pesach said, Sha'atam oimrim ba'aleinu l'shabeach, you say the words shehem mishtachavim lahevel vorik, that they bow to vanity. V'zeh b'gematria keminyan Yeshu, and this has the gematria of Yeshu. Vorik, so vorik is gematria 316. Kof is 100, Resh is 200, Vav is 6, Yud is 10, Varik 316, Yeshu Yud Shin Vav 316. When you guys say Aleinu l'shabeach and you say the words Lahevel Varik, you are having in mind the Christian founder. Va'atam oimrim, and then you further say about him U'mispalalim lelo yoshia. That's a little bit of a variation that we saw before. Before we saw that the words were le'el lo yoshia. Here it's maspalim lelo yoshia. We'll come back to that later. But the point of the accusation here is that you are saying that he's a God that who cannot help. V'atam oimrim, furthermore, you say lahavre gelulim min haaretz va'alilin karesu karesun. You talk about in va'alkein hakavlacha removing idols, and that you must be talking about Christian sites and Christian holy objects. And so this is the accusation that Pesach HaMeshumad makes against the Jewish community. This is obviously very, very problematic because Jews living in Christian Europe are allowed to live there, but one of the conditions is no blasphemies. And this would probably fall into the category of a blasphemy, and so the Jewish community is in jeopardy right now in the summer of 1390. So he continues writing, Rabbi Yom Tov Milhausen, in his Sefer HaNitzachon, and writes as follows: Va'an va'omer, and I responded, I ata moida sha'oisan hatzuroi shal eitz va'even sha'ata mishtachvim lahem. Don't you agree that you guys have statues in your churches and you bow to them? And you guys who are smart, you know that they're not real. They're just there to represent something. And you know that there isn't anything inherently sacred in these images. But don't you also agree that you have ignoramus people who don't realize this, and they think that these are actually divine beings? Is that not the case? And the inquisitors, we'll call them the Christian inquisitors, had to agree that indeed this is an internal Catholic problem where at Christian sites there are statues representing saints or whatever it is, and people who aren't sophisticated and knowledgeable about Christian doctrine assume that these are divine entities themselves, which is not true to Catholic theology. So they had to concede to that point. Once they conceded to the point, continues Rabbi Yom Tov and says as follows: Amarti lo, so I said, so you have a problem with us saying Aleinu? You are essentially agreeing to the tenets of Aleinu. Why? Because we're not talking about all non-Jews. We don't say Shaloi Asanu Kegoyim. Elanu Oimrim, we say Shaloi Asanu Kegoyim ha'aratzos, the people of the land. V'lo samanu k'mishpuches ha'adama, the families of the earth. Why are we stressing land and earth? Because we're talking about here is not silly city dwellers who are part of the guilds and are more sophisticated, the burghers, the citizens. No. Elo en akfarim, she'ena ba'ayar, we're talking about the villagers, she'oivdim adama, who they're engaged in agriculture and they have a reputation of being simple people. V'oisam einam yoidim emunah, they don't know the true Catholic beliefs. V'raksvurin she'oisan tzuris alehu shalachem, they think that these entities are divine. V'zorah rabba, this is terrible. And that's what Yeshaya meant when he said, this is what he means. People who take statues and attribute divinity to them. Obviously, statues can be no help to anybody. And you're agreeing that this is a problem within Christianity. And that's all we're referring to. And that's why we talk about Mishpachas Adama. We're talking about the simple people, the same people you have a problem with. And where did this problem come from? Because you guys have images, and that's why it would have been much better if you didn't have these images. And the Torah Taka says, in the 10 Commandments, and you Christians accept the 10 Commandments. And it says, and so therefore we're doing the right thing, the way it says in the Torah. We are essentially disparaging those people who take these statues seriously. You guys agree with this problem, and so you shouldn't really have a problem with us saying Aleinu l'shabeach. So that's in terms of the general theme of Aleinu. Reb Yom Tov feels that he's given an answer that solved the problem. There's one issue that remains, and that is part of the accusation was that Jews have in mind Yeshu when they say Lahevel Varik, because Varik is Gematria Yeshu. So now he needs to respond to that. What's he going to say about that? Amarti loy, so I said, Hanoitzrim loy karu lehem Yeshu. You guys don't call your God Yeshu. Kilbul shainam nikra Yezush. In your language, using the German here, he's called Yezush. Uvishainenu, and in Hebrew, nikra Yeshua with an ayin. And once you add the ayin, you mess up the whole gematria. So if we wanted to have him in mind, it would have been with an ayin. And so the gematria doesn't work. And clearly we're talking about someone else. And yes, maybe there's no way what you're saying is true, because there's no way we have him in mind because the gematria doesn't work out. And then he says, in fact, anytime you find in Judaism where the Gemara condemns a man named Yeshu Yin Shud Vav, you should know that it's not your guy, because it is a different name. In Hebrew it would be Yeshua, and so this is why you should not be worried at all about this. Now, he's not entirely clear here. Does he concede that Jews have Yud Shin Vav in mind? He doesn't really address that, but he just says it's not. We don't have in mind your guy. That's the main point of his argument over here. And as far as we can tell, he's writing this down. Presumably, he wouldn't have written this down in this essay if it wouldn't have worked out. So we have to assume that the end of the story here was a positive one, that the Jewish community was saved, which is why Reb Yom Tov put it in his work, wanting that other Jews in future generations should be able to be aware of this and be able to use his arguments for their benefit as well. So now we need to ask the simple question. And the simple question is, who is right? Was Pesach, the Meshumad, right? Or was this a false accusation? Reb Yom Tov told us that it was a false accusation, that Jews did not have Yeshu HaNotzri in mind at the time. But the question is, was he just defending Yiddishkeit in order to allow Judaism to survive? Or is this absolutely true? And if we look at the Korah in Rosh Hashanah Machzor on page 595, we'll see that Rabbi Sachs addresses this issue, and he writes as follows. During the Middle Ages, a Jew who had converted to Christianity cited this verse to make the false claim that Jews were criticizing or even ridiculing Christianity. In vain, it was pointed out that the offending verse was taken from two verses in the book of Yeshaya. Yeshaya lived at least 7 centuries before the birth of Christianity and therefore could not have possibly had it in mind. So here Rabbi Sachs is giving an argument for why it must have been a false claim. He says that it was pointed out. I'm not sure when this was pointed out. Rabbi Yom Tov Milhausen I did not see this in Rabbi Yom Tov's Sefer HaNitzachin, but maybe others said it, that how could it be referring to Christianity if it comes from 2 psukim in Yeshaya, and those psukim in Yeshaya are long before anyone was thinking about Christians, and so therefore by definition it needs to be a false claim. But what we want to do today is we want to take a closer look at this particular story. But either way, what we're able to do now is we're able to address the opening question. And we asked, how come it was okay in the 1200s and the 1300s to have the Aleinu l'shabeach in all its glory with no censorship? And why is it apparent that at a certain point later it had to be removed? Well, now we have a running theory. The running theory is that in 1390 in Prague there was an issue. This garnered a lot of attention, and we could understand that behemshich to this event in the late 1300s, sometime in the 1400s, or in the late 1300s to early 1400s, it was deemed to be the wise course of action to remove these words from the Aleinu. Either Jews were told they need to do this, or they chose to do it on their own, or both of them happened, and that explains why many of these Aleinu l'shabeachs underwent that censorship at that time. But at this point, we still have not answered the question about Moshav Yekarai, and we will come back to that later. But the main question we need to think about now is, was this claim by Pesach? Sometimes Jews who converted said very outrageous things about the Jews, and they were not true. So was this a true claim or a false claim? So let's turn to the Sefer that's called the Kolboy. The Kolboy, it's not entirely clear who authored it. The general assumption today is that it was written by one of the Rishonim, Reb Aaron HaKohen of Lunel in Provence. Late 13th century, early 14th century is when he writes this halachic work. The first print, it is assumed, is around 1490 in Italy, and we're looking at the Tfus Rishon, where he discusses Aleinu l'shabeach, and all of the other prints basically follow this same model as well. What does it say? Aleinu l'shabeach. The gematria of the word Aleinu is umad, 166. In other words, we're supposed to stand when we recite Aleinu l'shabeach, which is a universal custom, and that is hinted in the word Aleinu. Then it says like this, and here is where it's going to become very enigmatic. Lahevel varik, those two words. So about the word varik, big gematria. It has a gematria. What's the gematria? There's no material here. Then it goes further. Le'el lo yoishia. Remember the pasuk. Le'el v'shem ishtachlim lahevel varik u'mispalim le'el lo yoishia. So le'el loy gematria. Those two words le'el loy, again gematria. What's the gematria? No information here. V'yesh oimrim, and some people say that you should say lahevel varik. Lahevel vilarik is what it needs to. There's an assumption that there's a typo here. In other words, earlier it was lahevel varik. Now we're telling you lahevel vilarik with a lamid. Sheyesh bahem big gematria that has a gematria. What's a gematria? Nothing. This is what we have in the Sefer of the Kolboy Simin Kuf Chaf Beis. What is going on in this particular Kolboy? And when we see this, we automatically say, hold on, maybe what Pesach, the Meshumad, maybe what he said is not so crazy, because here we actually have a passage from this general region and general time period in where it does seem that there are gematrias and the author isn't telling them what they are. So there's, if this is probably something, if not a smoking gun, this is very close to a smoking gun. But we need to continue with our journey. I should just point out that in the most recent edition of the Kolboy, published by Feldheim, which is in 7 or 8 volumes or something like that. So volume 7, looking at here, printed in Tafshin Samach Beis, they print it exactly like this, and they write a footnote. They say, Halosh and loy borer, we don't know what this means. Now, is that willful ignorance or is it something else? That's something that we're going to have to figure out as we move along. Our story now is going to take us back to another Ksav Yad, another Machzor, another appearance of Aleinu l'shabeach in a Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur davening, and this is from what is known as the Worms Machzor. It's a 2-volume Machzor that for many years was in the Jewish Kehillah in Worms. It survived the Holocaust, and today it's in the National Library of Israel. Anyway, when we look at this Worms Machzor, and we go to the Rosh Hashanah Musaf davening, we find Aleinu over here, and very interestingly, for reasons I don't understand fully, the text was never erased. And here it says, Shem Ishtachon Lahevel Varik, without any censorship. However, there's 2 interesting things to note about this. Number 1, we find marginal writing in the, not marginal writing, but writing in between the lines of what looks like Trup, like Tlisha Gedoyla and Tlisha Katana. And we find this actually throughout the Machzor. And it seems that this was the Chazan keeping notes for himself about how to sing the Nagunim. And indeed, throughout there are notes that would say the Chazan should wait here, clearly talking to the Chazan. And this fits with the general picture because we know that this Machzor belonged to the Kehillah. And we also know that there was a tradition in Ashkenaz, the Ramah cites this in Shulchan Aruch, and this comes from the Maharil, and really the Maharil himself takes this from the Rekeach, that the Chazan, Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, should dafke use a communal Machzor because those were written Lishma, whereas an individual Machzor lav dafke, and therefore there's an inyan in using the communal Machzor. We know that this was a communal Machzor, and so when you see these writings in it, it would seem that the Chazan was using this to guide himself along in terms of how to sing the Nigun. So that's one thing we notice in this Machzor. The other thing we notice over here is that although I mentioned a second ago that there isn't a there isn't an erasure, there isn't a censorship, but there is a slight erasure. And that is, it once said over here, umispalalim el lo yoshia, the way they all did originally, and that was changed to umispalalim li lo yoshia. Very, very slight difference. I'll talk about it more later on, but the general censorship did not happen over here. So this is what happens in the Rosh Hashanah Musaf. Now let's go to the Yom Kippur Musaf, and we go to the Yom Kippur Musaf, we find the same story. We see a lot of notes to the Chazan over here that says the Chazan should be quiet here, the Chazan should stop here, the Chazan should wait here. We also see what looks like trup, different types of markings. They're not the same ones. They actually look different. In Rosh Hashanah, it looked like Tlisha Gedolas and Tlisha Katanas. Here they look like Shalshalasin. But they probably serve the same function. And as well, it used to say, U'mispalalim el lo yoshia. This was erased and changed to Mispalalim li lo yoshia. Okay, again, the reason for that difference we'll come back to later. But now what I want to focus on is we look at the marginal note. And we see in cursive handwriting, an unnamed individual writes a note here. And the first word, sometimes it's not so easy to make out all of these writing, but the first word that you're kind of able, or at least that for when I looked at this, what I was able to see right away is the word Muhammad. Mem, Ches, Mem, Dalid, Mahmad, the word Muhammad is right there. And the second I saw that, right away it triggered, there's this whole Yeshu story with Aleinu, and here I have a text of Aleinu, and I have the word Muhammad next to it. Is this in some way associated with the story? Or in other words, maybe what Pesach was saying is not so crazy if I have a hand writing the name Muhammad next to the Aleinu. Well, let's read the full note to see what it says. Remember, the Worms Machzor once had el lo yoshia. This was changed to mispalim li lo yoshia. The writer here writes, I like the original version better because that is consistent with the pasuk in Yeshaya Mem Hey. Then he says, v'yesh garsin on a third way of doing it. Le'el loy. So, not el loy, not liloy, but le'el loy. V'hu gematria Muhammad. And that is gematria Mem Ches Mem Dalid. So let's give an overview of the three different versions that we see over here and the advantage of each one. The original Aleinu was Shehem Shtachavin Lahevel Varikum Espalim El Lo Yoshia. What is the advantage of that version? It's Lishna Dekra, that's the Lashon of the Pasuk in Yeshaya. Then we saw in the Worms Machzor a change to Mispalim Li Lo Yoshia. The key difference over here is you're not saying to a God who does not save, you're just saying to that which does not save. I think what happened over here is at a certain point there was a discomfort with calling a foreign god a kale. That sounds a little odd. We don't do that all the time. So even though the pasuk did that, I think there was an impulse to not do that, which is why it was changed from umispalim el lo yoshia to umispalim li lo yoshia. And that's probably what happened in the Worms Machzor. And so therefore the person writing on the side, and this must be a Talmud Chacham to have an opinion about Nusach matters, is saying that he actually wants to restore it to its original Nusach. But then this same marginal note told us that there's a third version. And that is to say, and that le'el loy is gematria 92, because you have le'el loy is 3 lameds and 2 aleph. Le'el loy gematria 92. Mem ches mem dalid. Muhammad is gematria 92. And so there were those who said that we should be doing this type of girsa in order to reference Muhammad. So again, once you see this, then you realize that the allegation being made about Yeshu is not so off the wall, because if Jews and Aleinu are thinking in gematria terms about Muhammad, then maybe they are also thinking in gematria terms about Muhammad's competitor, and that is Yeshu. But before we further explore this, I want to pause here and try to figure out if we know who is the author of that marginal note. Now, we know, I suggested before, that the writings come from a Chazan in Worms. So the question is, there's good reason to believe, there's a circumstantial case that can be made, that this Ha'ara was also written by the Chazan in Worms, because the Chazanim are the ones writing these notes. And if so, do we know of a Chazan in Worms, who was also a Talmud Chacham, who could have an opinion about Nusach matters? We do know about a Chazan in Worms, who lived in the 1600s, And we get this information from the Sefer of Minhagim, the Chilas Kodesh Vermaiza. This was written by a Yid who was born in Worms in the year 1604. His name was Rabbi Yosef Shamish. He was very into the minhagim of this kehillah, and he wrote them down, documented them. This book was never printed until the late 1980s. Very valuable for learning any information about the kehillah in Worms, definitely during the 1600s. And he writes the whole Seder over here of how the Chazan and when the Chazan for Rosh Hashanah and Kippur was selected. He himself wrote his own Hagois to the Sefer, and he writes as follows. He writes that in the year Taf Lamed Aleph, so that would come out, because we're dealing with Rosh Hashanah and Kippur, which is before January, that comes out to the year 1670. The Parnas, the Merumam, Reb Chaim, the son of Moshe Shimshon, he was the Chazan. When was he the Chazan? He was a Chazan Shachris Yoitzer b'Yom Rishon. He was a Chazan Shachris b'Yom Rishon, and Yom Kippur he was the Chazan for Musaf. So again, for Rosh Hashanah he's not the Chazan for Musaf. The Chavas Yor is the Chazan for Rosh Hashanah, the first day Shachris, which is known as Tfilas Yoitzer, Yoitzer Uveri Cheshach, and the Yoitzers that were associated with that, and Yom Kippur he is the Chazan for Musaf. Who is this Chaim, the son of Rav Moshe Shimshon? We know exactly who this is. This is the Rav of Worms at the time, who's known as the Chavas Yor. That is the Sefer of Halacha that he wrote, and a very well-known figure. And the reason this footnote is presented here is because the Chiddush is that during that year of 1670, the Chavas Yor was in unveils for his father. And nonetheless, the Kehillah insisted that he should be the Chazan Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And he goes on to say that really, if this was anybody, they wouldn't have allowed it to happen, because an Ovel is not supposed to be a Chazan on Yom Tif. Because, however, he was such a good Chazan, and he goes on to say, he is Yedias Pirush HaMachzor in Kol HaKavanis. And he's a Charev and a Baki and a Lamdan God of a Chashuv, and he's great with Chazanis. He knows the Nigan of the Chazanis that Shayachim Liyam Narayim, and he's a and Gadol B'umnis HaChazanis, and Yesh Lei Kol Noim. Therefore, they insisted that he become the Chazan. So, if we know that the Chavas Yoyer was a Chazan in Worms, is it possible to assume, and we know the Chazanim were writing in the Machzor, is it crazy to suggest that the Chavas Yor is the one who wrote that ha'ara about the Girsa and Aleinu, and including the third Girsa telling us that it's Gematria Muhammad? Hard to say one way or another, until the following article was published in the late 1980s or early 1990s in the journal called Meiria. And this is an article written by Rabbi Yisrael Pellis. And he was doing a lot of research in Kisvei Yad from the Chavas Yor, because the Chavas Yor wrote Ha'aris to the Minhagim of Worms, the Sefer that I mentioned before. And we have the Ksav Yad Kodesh of the Chavas Yor. The Chavas Yor also has other works in Ksav Yad that were printed during this period of time, late 80s, early 90s, and we'll talk more about them soon. And so this Yisrael Pellis, Rabbi Yisrael Pellis, is involved in analyzing his handwriting. And then this Yisrael Pellis looked at this Worms Machzor and looked at this note and other notes as well in the margins, and what he found is that the handwriting is a perfect match for the handwriting of the Chavas Yor. And so therefore this is no longer just a guess. Now we can actually say with close to certainty that this note about the proper Girsa and Aleinu, including the third Girsa, telling us about Muhammad, as a Yesh Oimrim. He's not saying that he likes it. He's just saying that some people say that that seems to come from the Chavas Yor. Now what's interesting is, if you're a halting cup, you'll remember that when it came to Rosh Hashanah Musaf, I didn't tell you there is such a marginal note. There is no marginal note about anything of this sort on the Rosh Hashanah Musaf. It's Dafka, the Yom Kippur Musaf. And now, if you also remember, what did Rabbi Yosef Shamish tell us? Rabbi Yosef Shamish told us that when was a Chavas Yor Chazan, Rosh Hashanah, he was only Chazan for Shachris, which means he wouldn't have been preparing and looking at the Aleinu for Musaf. It was Dafke Yom Kippur that he was the Chazan for Musaf, so it makes sense that it was Dafke there that he wrote this note about the Gematria Muhammad, and so this also helps us round out the picture of what seems to have been happening over there. The only thing I should note is the following, a small caveat to this, and that is, the Chavas Yor also wrote, his name was, before they called him Chaim, and that's true, but he had a second name, Yor Chaim. Anyway, Yor Chaim Bachrach. That's how he's generally referred to. He also left in Ksav Yad a commentary to Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim, and this is known as Makar Chaim, and it was printed in the 1980s for the first time. And he writes over there that he was a chazan. He writes over there the minhagim of how to bow, and he says that he was a chazan for Musaf, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur. So here it would seem that he was also the chazan on Musaf or Rosh Hashanah. And so that's just, on the other hand, we know clearly that there were some years that was not the case. So it could be that later on he also became the chazan, Rosh Hashanah, Musaf as well. So what we did right now is we still haven't said clearly one way or another, but suddenly we're a lot closer. Because, let's summarize what we saw. We saw a Pesach accusing the Jewish community of having a man Yeshu during the Tefillah of Aleinu. And then I showed you a kol boy, extremely cryptic. It seems like material was taken out from there, and that was one smoking gun. And now I showed a second smoking gun, and where some people are talking about a gematria of Muhammad, and so therefore we can build a pretty strong circumstantial case that the accusation against the Jewish community at the time was in fact an accurate one, that they were having Yeshu in mind, number one, and number two, that this Yeshu was similar to the Muhammad, that just like the Muhammad was the founder of the religion that was known at the time, that so too the Yeshu was the founder of a religion that was known at the time, not some obscure different Yeshu, but the Yeshu. A strong circumstantial case can be made. However, we can't say that we have 100% evidence yet, and that brings us to the next and final piece to this puzzle. There's a work from one of the Rishonim from Ashkenaz, whose name was Avram ben Rebbe Azriel, and he wrote a sefer halacha, a sefer on the Siddur, includes also pirushim to the piyutim, and this sefer is called Arugas Haboisem. This sefer was never printed until 1963. There are two manuscripts that survive, and Ephraim Orbach published these. One of them was from the Vatican, and he has a commentary on Aleinu. And he says as follows: Shamaiti shekach yesh lehispalel lahevel varik. The right way to do it is to say lahevel varik. Now, this is a problem because the normal way in Ashkenaz at the time I showed before was to say lahevel varik. So the assumption here is that this is a typo. It really needs to be lahevel vilarik. He's coming to say a chiddush, that although the norm is to say lahevel varik, I'm coming and saying a chiddush that you should say lahevel vilarik. And why? Ki gematria Yeshu umachmat. It's gematria Yeshu yud shin vav, and Muhammad here is spelled mem ches mem tes, not a dalet at the end, but a tes at the end. Yeshu machmat. So if you're keeping score at home, that comes out to 413. And indeed, lehevel vilarik, with that lamed that I think he intends to say over here, comes out to 413. And so now we're hearing that all of a sudden this saying varik, gematria Yeshu, is not so off the wall anymore. And because we see from mamish this period in time, a work that was composed around 1234 is when it's assumed that Arugas Haboisem wrote his work. We see that some people said that you should say lahevel vilarik. Don't say varik. Varik only gets you Yeshu. But you should say lahevel vilarik, then it gets you Yeshu and Muhammad, and that's better because you're negating more. And so now this is much more than a smoking gun. And with this information, we can now come back to that enigmatic passage in the Kol Boy, and let's read what he was saying over there. Remember, he said, Aleinu is gematria umma. They got to stand up. Then let's read it as follows. Varik bigematria, right? What word is missing here? We know. The word that's missing here is bigematria Yeshu. Varik is 316, is gematria Yeshu. Then the text continues, Le'el loy bigematria Muhammad. And we saw that. Le'el lo Yoshia, rather than saying El lo Yoshia, Le'el loy, that from the Chavas Yor, it's gematria Muhammad. That's what the Kol Boy was trying to write over here. Then it goes V'yesh oimrim. Don't say lahevel varik, say lahevel vilarik. Add that extra lamed in sheyesh b'hem gematria, and then it ended, right? But we should continue and add the missing words Yeshu and Muhammad. Yeshu Machmad. And so basically there were three different ways of referring to the other religions that were prevalent at the time and that are still prevalent today. One was just worry about Christianity, and that varik gets you the gematria of Yeshu. Another was just worrying about a gematria that's dedicated to Muhammad, and that's le'eloi. So you get both of them. You say Shem Mishtach Lehevel Varik, Umispalim le'eloi Yoshia, then you get both of them. Another way of getting both of them is in the words Lehevel Vilarik themselves, without anything further. If you add the lamed in, then you get Yeshu or Muhammad 413. And so with that, it turns out that this was absolutely true. That it seems that, I don't know, we could say all Jews, but many Jews, when they were saying Aleinu during the medieval period, were having in mind the competing religions. When they said the words Shem Mishtach Lehevel Velarik Umispalim Elelo Yeshia, they had that in mind. The accusation was not a false accusation, but a true accusation. Obviously, the rabbis then, and perhaps today, need to do what they need to do in order to ensure the well-being of the Jewish community, but this is something that becomes clear from the sources that we're looking at. Now, with this background, we may be able to understand something quite interesting about the famous incident that happened in the year 1171 in Blois. We spoke about this in the class on Chaf Sivan and the history of that day. In short, Jews were accused of killing an innocent child in order to put blood in matzah. This is the first blood libel in continental Europe, excluding what happened in England. And this is in the year 1171. That leads to the Tainus of Chaf Sivan. If you read the Sefer Gzeres Ashkenaz Tzarfas, which has the medieval account of this episode, this Sefer was printed in Tafshin Vav. In this account, it says that when these Jews, these innocent Jews, when they were killed, and they were killed by being burnt alive in a house, it says that they started singing Aleinu L'Shabeach. And you need to wonder, from all songs, why they sing Aleinu L'Shabeach. And we may have our answer now. The Jews were offered a chance to convert to Christianity, and that would save their lives. So this is on their mind. And so the prayer that says, no, that's vanity, that Yeshu is not the answer, that's what's on their minds. They just refuse that to save their own lives. I think that adds context to why they would have, from all songs, sing the tefillah of Aleinu L'Shabeach. Now, need to say a few more important things before we close out this year. And that is, I mentioned before, the Makar Chaim, the Chavos Yair, Rabbi Yair Chaim Bachrach, he quoted on the side of the Machzor that some people say that you should say Le'eloi to get you the gematria of Muhammad. But he himself, if you read the note carefully, he said that he prefers Eloi Yeshia. He wants to go to Lashon HaPasuk. So, in other words, he's not a big fan of this gematria thing. And the truth is, we learn more about that from his Pirush Makar Chaim. When we look at his Pirush Makar Chaim and Hilchas Tefillah Simin Kof Lamed Beis, he brings that some people say you should say Le'eloi Yeshia because it's gematria Muhammad, but then he says, I want to tell you why this doesn't really add up and it doesn't make sense. He says, he quotes the Rambam's Igeres Teiman. The Rambam in Igeres Teiman is dealing there with the fact that the Jewish community was dealing with a big crisis and they were being forced to convert to Islam. And one of the things that the Muslims did is they brought from the Pasuk, when the Pasuk speaks about Yishmael, it says, Bereshis Perek Yuzayim Pasuk Yud Ches V'Yifreisi Oischa B'Moed Ma'od. Hashem says about Yishmael that he will become abundant B'Moed Ma'od. And some people took those two words B'Moed Ma'od, and if you take those two words, it's gematria 92. And some people said, oh, that's that shows you that the bracha of Yishmael applies to Muhammad. And so here now the Torah, God forbid, is alluding to Muhammad, and they're using that, and that's the real part of the God forbid. They're using that as a justification to say that it's okay for Jews to convert to Islam. So the Rambam responded to this, and he said that it's such nonsense. And interestingly, what's his point? His point is that if you know Islam well, his name isn't Muhammad, Mem Ches Mem Dalid, his name is Ahmad. And he says that if you read their writings, this becomes very clear, and so that undermines the entire gematria scheme. I don't know enough about the history of Islam to be able to comment on that, but what the Chavos Yair does is he says, so if the Rambam is right, then this whole gematria here doesn't make sense, and so that's why he likes the Lashon HaKasu. So he's consistent. What he writes here in Makar Chaim is consistent with what the implication of his marginal note. It's still interesting that he, both here and there, he brings the tradition, but he personally prefers to negate it. He then goes on in the same piece to say, that he's also not a fan of this. Let me read the text and then we'll see clearly. It says V'yesh oimrim gam varik gematria, that the word varik is a gematria. Okay, we know what happened here. He didn't write it out because the Ksav Yad Kodesh doesn't have the word, but he chose not to write it out. But clearly varik was Yeshu. But he says he's also not a fan of that. Ve'ein lanu lachapes hacher gematria. Don't do it. Why? Moshav Yekara Yoichiach. Moshav Yekara is going to show us. Remember, I said before that these Machzorim originally said Moshav Yekara, and then they were changed to the Chisei Kvoidai. Why were they changed? So the Chavis Yor here is pointing to the problem. What's the gematria of Yekara? The gematria of Yekara is 316. If you're going to say that Varik refers to Yeshu, then Moshav Yekara could, Chas v'Shalom, God forbid, refer to Yeshu as well. We don't want that. And this bothered Jews earlier in the 1200s, 1300s, and that's why they amended the text, changing it from a Moshav Yekarai to Chisei Chvoidai. Sometimes even putting that in the original text of the Machzor, written in the early 1300s. In other words, it kind of snowballed. It began by a gematria. I don't know that we know exactly when it began, but it began with a gematria of Yeshu or Muhammad, or both of them, or Yeshu and Muhammad, whatever it was. But once that took on a life of its own, all of a sudden people realized, oh yeah, Moshav Yekara Bashmana, you want to say that about Yeshu too? And so they changed the text of Aleinu in order to deal with that particular problem. Says a Chavis Yor, let's just cut out this gematria game, let's end it. Cypher Muhammad, he doesn't like it because of the Geras Teman. Cypher Yeshu, he doesn't like it because of a Moshav Yekara. He says, let's move away from this. Fine. So he's writing this in the 1600s. And we could see here a push from Agadol B'Yisrael to say, let's cut out this whole scheme in the 1600s. But the evidence does suggest that in 1390, when Pesach spoke, this was not the case. And Pesach's accusation was an accurate type of accusation. Okay, now in order to close out our shir, let's now talk about the nusach of Chabad for dealing with this particular passage in Aleinu. Because what happened basically is that when printing began in Aleinu, most of the printings, I can't say all, but most of the printings just said V'gar Aleinu Chol HaMoinam and jumped to V'anachnu Koirim, and this is how most of these Sidurim and Machzorim were printed. What about Chabad? The first print of Alter Rebbe Siddur is assumed to be in the year 1802 in Shklov. And a few years ago, there's one copy in the world remaining in the Rebbe Rashab's collection that is today in Moscow. A few years ago, they uploaded this online, so we could read it today. And we go to Aleinu in the weekday davening, and we see it says, period, v'anachnu koidem. So very similar to how other Sidurim are done. However, what's interesting here is that Aleinu does not only appear once in the Alter Rebbe Siddur, it appears a second time, this in the Musaf for Rosh Hashanah. And here also says, and it goes on to say, but you look well over here, you actually see that there are two parenthesis marks. First, a left parenthesis mark, then a right parenthesis mark, and these two marks are between V'gar Aleinu K'chol HaMoinam and V'anachnu Koidem. So when I look at this, I assume this is a siman for the reader that there are additional words here that have to be added in. And indeed, this was not unusual. I looked at two other Sidurim printed around the time of the Alter Rebbe. Seder Tfilis Mekal Hashana, Amsterdam, 1725. Seder Tfilis Mekal Hashana, London, 1772. These are just two that were easily accessible. And V'gar Aleinu K'chol HaMoinam, between that and V'anachnu Koidem, where the text is missing, there's a star, there's a circle, there's some sort of indicator here telling the reader, with no information, but telling the reader there's other words that were removed. It seems that the Alter Rebbe was doing the same here in his original Siddur, giving you two parenthesis marks, telling you that there's additional words that need to be added here. What exactly those are, he doesn't tell us, but he's alluding to this. Why does he do it only in the Musaf Rosh Hashanah and not in the everyday Shachris? So either he intended to do it in both and it just didn't end up happening. Maybe it's a printer's error, or maybe every day doesn't matter. Rosh Hashanah is more important, and that's when the Alter Rebbe wanted us to make sure to get this text perfectly right. When we move forward and look at the Torah Ur Sidurim, we see here, Aleinu kol hamoinam v'anachnu koidim, and this is how the Torah Ur Sidurim, like most Sidurim printed in the world, were handled at the time. Not even a siman indicating that anything was removed. So what is the minhag Chabad taka of what should be said? So the Friedrich Rebbe has a letter. This letter was written in Tes Zayin Shvat Tov Reish Tzadik Beis. It's the beginning of 1932. To a man named Rabbi Yisrael. It's printed in the Igros Kodesh. And this person says, he's asking about Aleinu. So the Friedrich Rebbe writes, She'elasoi benidin hanusach ba'aleinu. You want to know about betfilas Aleinu. So what is the minhag Chabad to do? Hine nehigin nusach harishan shekosev. We follow the first version, which is shehem mishtachim lehevel vilarik va'anachnu koidem. So there's two chidushim here. We do not continue and say the second clause that originally was there, u'mispavlim el lo yoshia, lil lo yoshia. None of those three versions do we say, but we do say shehem mishtachlim lehevel vilarik, not varik, which is the original one that has that gematria of 316. That's gematria. No, lehevel vilarik. Those two. Now we remember lehevel vilarik still has a gematria that we spoke about before. Lehevel vilarik together is a gematria 413 Yeshua and Muhammad. Though I'm not saying by any stretch that is the intention or that's the kavanah. I'm just pointing out that happens to be a reality. And the Friedrich Rebbe goes on to say, and we don't continue and say u'mispalim, etc. This is what the Friedrich Rebbe wrote. The Rebbe has a rishima of the summer of Tov Reish Tzadik Zayin, where the Friedrich Rebbe tells the Rebbe as follows: I asked the Rebbe Rashab about spitting at Aleinu, and he said that the reason why we spit at Aleinu is because from the speech we generate saliva, and we don't want to benefit from that saliva. And the Shalah discusses this issue, and this is what the Rebbe writes in this particular rishima. So here comes the second idea, a minhag that's already mentioned by the Taz. Sources in the 1600s talk about this minhag about spitting by Aleinu, and here we're learning that this is part of the nusach. This is part of the minhagim Chabad as well, and it's given. A reason is given here. Now, I've always wondered about this. There are other times in davening when we speak about negativity, including allude to idol worship, and yet there isn't a concern of not wanting to benefit from that roik. Is it possible to say that maybe has to do with this gematria story? That precisely because there is these allusions in these words to other things, that maybe it makes these words more offensive to us. And I don't know. I'm just throwing that out as a possibility. In terms of the reference to the Shalah, when they printed the Rishimis, they noted that they never found a Shalah supporting the custom of spitting. In fact, the Shalah in the Sefer Emek Bracha, which is his father's Sefer, the Shalah writes a ha'ara over here, and he writes that he's not a fan of the spitting at Aleinu. He doesn't think this is good for Jewish and Gentile relations. He also writes, interestingly, Aleinu has nothing to do with them. Aleinu has nothing to do with them, because it was written by Yeshua. Yeshua had nothing to do with Christianity. He's talking about Avodah Zarah, so why are we mixing in with the people today? And so therefore he doesn't like the idea of the spitting. He also says it looks like they're spitting by the words of Anachnu Kodim. This is the ha'ara of the Shalah to the Sefer Emek Bracha. What's interesting is he's relatively speaking contemporary with the Chavas Yair. We saw the Chavas Yair pushing back against the Gematria scheme, saying, no, let's not do that. And we see something similar here where the Shalah is saying it's talking about the pagans and Yeshua, and we shouldn't be thinking about the contemporary people around us. But the bottom line is that both of these pieces, the piece of the Rishimis and the piece from the letter, both become the minhag Chabad as written by the Rebbe in the Hayom Yom of Tes Tevis, where he first says what the nusach is. He says the nusach is Shem Eshtachim Lehevel Vilarik, and we don't say anything further. And then he says the minhag of spitting and the reason that we spoke about before. And so this is the minhag of Chabad. Now, the question that I want to deal with, and this will mamish be the end of the shir, is why is this Hayom Yom on Tes Tevis? We know, and there's a lot of good examples of this, that when the Rebbe puts specific items on specific days, very, very often we're able to find out and learn that there's a deeper reason and connection between the concept and the day. And as I'm going to show you, that's going to be true over here for Tes Teves as well. So let's have a look. There is a siman in Shulchan Aruch, Orach Chaim siman Tov Kuf Pei, that comes from the Tur in Orach Chaim Tov Kuf Pei, that really comes from the Halachas Gdolos, which is from the period of the Go'anim, and it lists an entire list of fasts over there. And this is the lashon of the Baal Halachas Gdolos. Elu yamim shenis anim bahem min ha-Torah. These are days that we're supposed to fast min ha-Torah. And it goes on to say, for example, on Ches Nisan, Shnei bnei Aaron, Nadab and Avihu passed away, so there should be a fast. On Yud Nisan, Miriam Hanaviah passed away, and so there should be a fast. On Chavav, Nisan, Yoshua ben Nun passed away, and there should be a fast. And this, he continues. He also includes fasts that are very well known, like Tzom Gedalia and Asara B'Teves and Shiva Asar B'Tamuz in here, in this list. But there's also many other lists, many other items that are mentioned here, most of them being yartzites. Obviously, the second anyone saw this text, the question was, what does it mean? Shemes anim behem min ha-Torah. There's a biblical chiyuv. Even Shiva Asar B'Tamuz is not a biblical chiyuv. How much more so Ches Nisan or dates like that? And interestingly, when the Tur quotes this lashon, he quotes it like this: Elu yamim shemes anim behem min ha-Torah. So right away, the Beis Yosef Karon, his Pirush on the Torah, writes, it's called min ha-Torah, loymar sheish lizor behem k'mo shel Torah. You have to be careful in it, k'mo shel Torah. Even that is a little share. Why would you need to be careful like that? There's a reason things are min ha-Torah, there's a reason things are min darabanan. Also, the reality is that no one is careful in all of these fasts in the same way like a fast min ha-Torah. In fact, most of these aren't observed. But that's not the main thing that we need to discuss now. What we need to discuss is when it comes to Tes Teves. Remember, Tes Teves is the day that the Rebbe decided to put the information about Aleinu under Tes Teves. So, every day, the Baal Halachas Gdolos told us the date, followed by what happened on that day. Here, what do we get? B'Tisha B'Av of Teves, Loi Kosvu Rabbi Seinu Al Mahu. The rabbis didn't tell us what it is. So there's a fast, and we don't know what this fast is about. This is the only one where we're not given information about what this fast is. Now, some of the Mefarshim say, oh, well, it must be that Ezra passed away on that day. Yeah, but he goes on to say that after. Uvoy Bayoim Meis Ezra HaKohen. So clearly, that's not what he's talking about when he says, Loi Kosvu Rabbi Seinu Al Mahu. It's separate from the day Ezra, and if it was only that Ezra passed away on that day, then he would have just said that. On B'Tisha B'Av, Ezra passed away. Something is very mysterious about this text where it says there is a fast on the 9th of Teves, which turns into then, if you're doing that, it turns into 2 days consecutively. He actually has over here also Ches Teves. He has a fast for the day that the Torah was translated into Greek. But anyway, what is the date of Tes Teves? Well, let's go back to the end of the 11th century when you had a Yid who lived in Barcelona whose name was Rabbi Avram Berchia Hanasi. And he wrote a sefer on the Jewish calendar that is called Sefer Ibur. And this sefer was in Kav Yad for a very long time, printed relatively late in the history of printing. And he writes over there as follows. He's talking about the non-Jewish calendar. He was comparing it to the Jewish calendar. And he starts talking about how the Christian calendar is set up. And he starts talking about that they count from the day that they think their founder was born. And he goes on to say, V'hu noila l'divrayim, he was born, and he gives a year, Gimel alafim tafshin samach aleph lebrias oilam. That's the Jewish, from the year of creation, 3,761. Be'esrin v'chamisha yamim b'chodesh December, the 25th of December, that's what they claim. And then he says, when does that come out in the Jewish calendar? So Reb Avram says, V'hu yom Shabbos, comes out to be Shabbos, Yom Tisha b'Teves, the 9th of Teves, is the day that it comes out. If that is true, it's a good day. It's good that he was born on that day. He doesn't explain what does he mean by that. Why is it a good day? Tisha b'Teves, I don't know. But he goes on to say, no one believes them that they really know when he was born. No one really believes them that it was the 25th of December. And he goes on to say, it doesn't say it in the Gospels or things like that. V'loi bekisvei talmidim, and on the early church fathers, it doesn't say anything about them. Asherim aminim bahem. And so he goes on to say that really it was a day that was a pagan holiday and the Christians just appropriated it, and goes on to say that we don't really believe them, that this is the day. However, this already plants a seed. That their argument was that he was born on Tes Teves, and what if you disagree with what Rabbi Avram bar Reb Chia Anasi says? And what if you say, you know what, I do believe them about it? Then that all of a sudden would make the halachas gedolos make sense that a fast was declared on Tes Teves for that particular day. And indeed, we know that at least some Jews throughout history did accept this particular claim. There is a sefer printed in 1710 on Megillas Tainus. Megillas Tainus is a work that comes from the era of the Tanoim, listing the different days that it was forbidden to fast or to make a hesped. A commentary was written in the late 1600s or early 1700s by a rabbi named Rabbi Yehuda Leib, the son of Menachem. He was the dayan in Krotzen, and this commentary that he wrote is Tosfos Chadashim. And Megillas Tainus at the end has this siman from the Baal Halachas Gedolos. It was added in of all these fasts that we spoke about before. And so the Tosfos Chadashim, Rabbi Yehuda Leib, printed in 1710, says about 9th of Teves, we don't know what it is. But he writes, I heard that that's when he was born. So in other words, there were Jews who accepted this claim that he was born then, despite Reb Avram bar Reb Chia's protest that he doesn't believe them. There were others who did believe them. And this does seem, and this would add up with the fact that we have this mysterious fast day that they didn't even want to tell us what it's about, would also go to suggest that there was at least a desire to accept what Rabbi Avram bar Reb Chia Anasi say, at the very least to say, even if we don't accept it, but we need to choose one day, so let's choose their day as being the fast. So again, even if you're not mamish accepting what historically happened, but if they chose that day, then that's enough for us to say that it should be a fast on that particular day. This Tosfos Chadashim was very well known. It was printed multiple times, and I think that would explain the reason why the Rebbe put this on Tes Teves. So in other words, Tes Teves, what I'm trying to say here is that the Rebbe seems to be bringing it back into the anti-Christian tone, because that's the only reason to put it on Tes Teves. Tes Teves is a tainus. Why? Because that's the day that the Christian founder was born, L'daitam. Given that Aleinu has a history of, in one way or another, negating Christianity with the gematria, so maybe that's a reason about the nusach, especially about those key words of Shehem Eshach Lehevel V'Larik, and especially about spitting. And remember, I said before that maybe the spitting becomes all the more necessary, specifically because it isn't idol worship in the abstract, but something very known and odious to Jews who are living at and thinking about this other religion. And that may be why this ends up Tes Teves. Of course, there's a lot of speculation in what I'm just saying, but I think the pieces kind of come together in this way. So we began, Aleinu L'Shabeach begins with a text that probably is not in its original intent talking about Christians, but what we do find is that at a certain time, Jews did start thinking about other religions. The gematria scheme was a reality. In 1390, this turned into a problem. That led to the erasures in the Machzorim that we saw before, and eventually the censorship in the printing as well. We saw some pushback from Gedolei Yisrael in the 1600s saying this is not something that they're really interested in. But then we see that it looks like in the Chabad story, in addition to discussing what the nusach is and what we do, there does seem to be some linkage, some echo of this anti-Christian polemic in the Chabad custom, or at least in the Chabad Hayom Yom, where we have this passage placed dafka on Tes Teves. Other things have been written about the day Tes Teves. That's not the purpose here. My feeling is that this is what the Rebbe had in mind when he placed it on that day. I want to conclude with the following. The Bach discusses the fact that the minhag became to say Aleinu L'Shabeach at the end of every single tefillah. It's the last thing we do in shul before we go out to the world. The Bach, writing in Erech Chaim Siman Kuf Lamed Gimel, writes as follows: Hatam Litkoya bilvavenu koidem sheniftaron lebadheim. Before we go home, we need to entrench in our hearts Yichud Malchus Shamayim. V'sheyechazek bilvavenu amunuzu, and make it strong. Ki oz, then gam ki yesh l'chalecha miyisrael masol matanim hagoyim oivdei avodah zara v'giluleim u'matzlichim. Although all Jews have interactions, after Shachris, you're going into the marketplace, you're going to be dealing with people who have very different belief systems, and they're matzliach, very often that they're doing well off. And so there could be a thought, you know something? They have life better. Maybe I should join them. No, so we say Aleinu, le'nifna levaveinu ala lilim, v'lo'yala b'machshava chas shalom shum hirar avera. So in other words, Aleinu for the Bach is not some prayer about old pagans. Aleinu for the Bach is something that we say every day in order to remind ourselves and to talk about ourselves and to say, I know that what they're dealing with is very successful, but I'm with what's true. And if so, I think this would explain the impulse to do these gematrias. In other words, Jews wanted this tefillah to talk to themselves, like the Bach is saying it should. And so they were like, yeah, Yeshu and Muhammad, I know that they're wealthier, and I know that they are living more free, but that is lehevel v'lorik, that is lo yoshia. And by adding those gematrias, they were making this tefillah more relevant to them, allowing it to talk to them and to inspire them and to help keep them on the proper path. And if this is correct, then I think we need to ask ourselves the following question today. What is today's lehevel? What is today's varik? And maybe we should make our own gematria for whatever is presumed to be the most tempting thing that causes us to sometimes have a machshavas chutz, or sometimes to adopt a non-Jewish way of thinking about the world. And lav dafke comes from something that identifies as a religion. And these could come from other places as well. And part of Aleinu is to call that out. Part of Aleinu is to say that I'm going to stand up to that as well. And that will allow us, Taka, to be truer Jews, just like our ancestors tried being truer Jews living in Europe.